fighting vipers in the Viper Theater. Fighting Vipers, the ultimate fighting game, only on Sega Saturn.
Right. Okay, so as I've said several times throughout this retrospective, Sega Saturn had a really hard time with 3D, and that meant that a lot of the really popular fighting games that were out at the time weren't getting ported to the Sega Saturn. While Capcom was sure to support them with ports of all their great fighting games, many of which were very popular, they didn't get any of the 3D fighters, which is where the real money was at the time. Soul Edge, they did get Dead Alive on the Saturn, Tekken, and Street Fighter EX. None of that came to the Saturn. And while Sega could hang their hat on the Virtua Fighter series, that series just wasn't innovating in the same way that others were, so they had a smaller team of developers playing around with the 3D hardware in an effort to try and produce some more interesting games for the console, and what they would come up with would become known as Fighting Vipers. So the story of this game, it centers around another international fighting tournament, though this one centers around a much younger crop of fighters. So you have fighters based on, teenage stereotypes. So you have punk rockers, you have extreme skaters, banjo stereotypes, even a cosplayer is in there somewhere. And it actually does work in the game's favor. It does create a unique vibe compared to other fighting games. And it still stands out, even today. The presentation is pretty strong, while the animation isn't really that good. The character models are pretty good. The backgrounds are great. And there's some detailed animation in there too, so yeah, it's pretty strong. Great music as well. Sound effects are also super impactful, especially when you land a hit that's powerful enough to knock someone out of the ring and through the barrier, which brings us to the gameplay nicely. So Fighting Vipers is a pretty straightforward fighting game. It's essentially just Virtua Fighter 2 in regards to how it controls. But it does have some interesting characteristics. For starters, all the rings have barriers now, so there's no ring outs, unless you can hit someone so hard that they actually smash through the barrier, which is really satisfying. You can also use the barriers to your advantage. You can hop off them to get around your opponent, or you can swing your opponent into it, which is really cool. But the most interesting component of Fighting Vipers is the armor system. If you manage to hit an opponent in the same spot enough, you'll actually break a piece of their armor off, and whenever you hit that person in that spot again, you'll do more damage. It's actually a really good system that I kind of would like to see expanded upon in other games. I don't know why they didn't explore it more, but regardless of its unique ideas, I don't think Fighting Vipers was a terribly popular game. Though it does have its following, it's not as highly regarded as Virtua Fighter or any of the other fighting games I mentioned from the time. Still, Sega was impressed with their work, and because they had used the Sonic characters as a basis to get a grip on the 3D hardware, they ended up making some Sonic character models, which prompted them to propose the idea of doing a 3D Sonic fighting game, which would become Sonic the Fighters. Sonic the Fighters was actually supposed to get a Sega Saturn port, but the console died before that could happen. That's not a huge loss though, because Sonic the Fighters isn't that great a fighting game. They also took a page from Capcom and decided to mix a few of their 3D fighters together. So they took characters from Virtua Fighter, Fighting Vipers, and Sonic the Fighters, as well as a few guest characters, and made Fighters Mega Mix. Though the only reason I remember this game is because it lets you fight as the car from Daytona, USA, and a giant Smokey the Bear looking thing that isn't even properly animated. Like, it's too stupid to make up. I just love that it exists. But yeah, these are still some fun games and some of the better fighters on the Sega Saturn, so recommend it if you're interested in checking out the hardware. But that's going to do it for today, guys. Join me tomorrow as we continue on with the next game.